Belief is one hell of a drug. So, choose what you believe carefully. Oh yeah, that's right. DJ Z in the background, and I just said belief is one hell of a drug. Take a moment and enter the theater of your imagination and contemplate that. Hello, and welcome to an episode of the almost daily ZenCast, the umbrella production that contains all the other podcast sub-segment special series within it. Thank you for being here. Let's play that old school intro for anyone who's never heard it before. This is the almost daily ZenCast. Hello, and namaste. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. I am your humble host, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. Let's get started. Indeed, friends, welcome. Namaste. Greetings. Thank you for tuning in. Smash that follow button, drop your comments, and head on over to solo.to/Mr. Zeppo to give yourself a self-guided tour of all the many projects within the project of many projects. Okay, so belief. That's one of the things, ginormous pin on the cork board. I haven't figured out a little song for that, but eventually we will. If you don't know what that means, hang on a second. I usually explain it at least once an episode or every other episode. You'll get the hang of it. If you know what's up, please search through your mind and or through any notes you've been taking about belief and what I've said about it, especially in any episodes with the title including the word belief. There's a handful of those. Go ahead and look those up. But let's zoom out. Why is it a pin on the corkboard? Why is the word, the concept, the very notion of belief something that me, myself, and I, and a few others, it's not just some imaginary conversation in my head. Why do some of us believe? Whoa. That got recursive real quick. That's pin on the corkboard next to the word, one of the many pins on the corkboard next to the word belief is particularly in English, I cannot assert the same is as common or true in other languages, but I assume that in the ones that are most related to, this also happens. But we believe in believing here in English. I don't know if that's also true in French. I don't know that if we went all the way back to Latin and, that cloud of ancient languages from that time and before, if we would find the same recursive nature, the self-defining nature. But belief is the power of believing. We don't have a really great answer. It's a shame that which one's the right one? I always get these two confused. Etymology or entomology? The one that's about words and not about creepy crawly bugs. Linguists et al., those who know authoritatively, aren't out here en masse and in force reminding the world that belief has had its various definitions. Now let's take a step back, big step back. Take a deep breath. I was gonna do a special something, and then I completely blew through it because I got into the spirally thoughts. Join me as we take a moment to take a deep step back and reflect on this giant all caps word and its variants. Oh, insert a pin on the corkboard. Isn't it fascinating? And this is, again, something that's particularly true of English, and maybe less so, but also kind of true of other Western languages. We use some words way too dexterously, with way too much ambiguity. Like the word belief is kind of standing up for words, for multiple ideas or multiple concepts. Another set of spiraling out of control sidebar pins, all of which are imaginary, brackets. Don't think too hard about that. And you know, that's why it's urgent that we unpack it, because people base their convictions on their beliefs, and then some people take action on their convictions to create a chain of potential causality there. But let's reel back. The thing I wanted to do before we got too in depth to this, was take a moment, because I believe in something, and that's the power of shared, focused, concentrated, manifesting thought, or AKA prayer. Now, many poo-poo on the idea. I'm not religious, as it were. In other words, I'm not a card-carrying member of any one particular group. I'm not even technically a member of the Omnists. I think I'm saying that right. Which is a delightful concept that there's a little bit of truth in all the different faiths as we know them now. Especially if we dig past the postmodern reconceptualizations of each of them, which there is varying degrees of going on in all the clubs, in my humble opinion. They are in the spectrum of organized religious institutions as we see them in the world, which, I would argue, is very separate from the very individual journeys of personal faith. They are intertwined, but not the same thing. And there's all kinds of theologians would have a lot to say about that from all the different groups. My critique is mostly focused on the postmodern institutionalized, organized religious entities and how they are behaving and how their ideological acolytes and not neophytes. Is that one of the right kind of words, right, to throw in there? But I digress. There's so many fun, interesting tangents and sidebars. Put pins on the corkboard there on all those ideas, friends, and take note. And if you've got questions, comments, things that you already want to discuss and your own sidebars, come on down to either the Facebook page for the Almost Daily ZenCast and find this episode and drop your comment beneath it, or to the Sprecher.com collection of all and go to the main Almost Daily ZenCast, find this episode, and drop your comment attached to that. Those are the two places I'll find them the most readily, and you are humbly invited at all times. If you're new to this podcast, I invite you to jump around. Look up keywords that might interest you. Get a hang for the different special sub-series and maybe do a deep dive. I keep a random collection of the various many shows on the main page, but they also each have their own reservoir. Okay, reeling it back, friends. There is so much to say about belief, its many genres, to put it one way, the many genres of belief, and the many forms in which it is impacting our collective well-being. But for a moment, please, I want you to join me in setting those all aside, respectfully, up on your imaginary or very real corkboard with pins on it. or notebook or whatever, or just, the tab in your mind that you keep it running, these ideas running in. Set them aside for a hot second. And whatever you believe, join me in choosing to take a moment to sit, take a few deep breaths, take a moment of silence with me together here on this show for any and all living human beings on this planet that may be suffering the consequences of other people's tyranny in one way, shape, or form or another. And let us include in this moment of silence all those that are causing the madness, all those responsible, all those on the front lines and behind the desks that have, in one way, shape, or form or another, contributed to the collective experience of the world arriving to this moment where it's at. And let us summon, request, humbly beg for species-wide forgiveness and spiritual transformative healing. Just a brief moment. Nothing fancy, in your own words, silently in your mind. And a moment, please. Let us begin now. All right. Thank you. I don't know if that felt like too short or not long enough or too long, or how that experience was experienced by you, but I thank you humbly for joining in doing so together. Belief. It's a huge concept. Arguably, an ideological construct unto itself, so old, so apparently persistently believed in. There's that self-referencing again. That it lives in the world with some power, apparently. It has power, right? The way power has power. The way greed accumulates power, these all caps words that we talk about and throw around and often wag fingers at others about. But what are these things really? What is this belief? I think if there was ever a time in human history for each and every one of us, regardless of our origin story, and I say that with all due respect, right, to everyone potentially listening to this, setting everything aside and joining together in a robust, genuine, authentic, personal, inward journey that involves this actual questioning of the very things we hold, arguably, for many people in the world, most dear. And that's threatening. Pin on the corkboard. I get it. But if as many, this is a tired trope, but if not now, when? There's another, there's other parts to that adage, to that saying, I believe. But the critical one, if not who, if not us, who? They're all as important, and I get it, right? In yesterday's episode, I alluded to these sort of quite obvious but generally set aside divisions on both sides of the American Trumptopian political ideological divide. And they each have their consequences, and I meant to go into them, but I realized I was spiraling out of control, so I didn't get into it. I don't only mean to invoke them here and now because we have seemingly the same sort of division if we look through a lens of demographic alignment and say there are two kinds of people in the world. Now, all of those sorts of setups are artificial, right? We have to always remember that. We think up things that are not reality itself. They are representations of what are most likely, our ideas of what might be most likely in reality. It's possible that out there in the world, there are two groups of people that are sort of stuck in the tug of war and they need to pick a side. And everyone feels strong convictions. And possibly there's a middle path, right? Possibly. Stick with me. I know that sometimes my narrative gets confusing. But there are those out there of whatever, and like I said, setting aside all backgrounds, backstories, and origin stories, whatever you may or may not have been raised in, and or taught, and or indoctrinated, and I use that word in the most benign version of its definition possible, right? Not in the judgy, that means you're bad, that means you don't know what you're doing kind of way. Let's just admit it. All human culture is a form of indoctrination. It's only truly problematic when we deny that and ignore the consequences of clinging to puzzle pieces that don't make sense or, modalities, motivating ideologies that don't make sense or that are toxic or dangerous or violent. Okay? We are now this may or may not always be relatively true, but let's argue that it is heightenedly true right now. We are in a junction, a node point in the living, evolving, unfolding, ever-present experience that is history in the making. And because of the way life is, those of us who will look back on all of this with clear, or let us argue, as clear a mind and a clear set of eyes as possible, we'll have things to say about which way things go. So to bring it back to my point there, in the world, in the demographic, there's a Venn diagram of folks who think transformative, spiritual enlightenment, healing, and evolution may be possible, but now is not the time to even bother trying. There's too many other fires to put out. And there's an overlapping circle of analysis, right, where we might group all the people who think it may be possible and we'll never truly find out if we don't figure out a way to stop running on the treadmills that we're running on, lighting the fires that we're lighting, and then having to run about trying to put them all out again, therefore keeping us all sufficiently preoccupied at a collective level that we cannot engage in the experimental collective exploration required to answer the question of whether or not the human species is capable of achieving the one thing that I've been mocked and ridiculed for the entire multiple decades that I've been asking these questions, but that I keep coming full circle around after going through my own inventory of questioning and revisiting and seeking out different perspectives and or, commentary about it out there in the world. And through personal investigation of techniques and ideas that cluster in and around the vortex of this theme. Species-wide, collective, individual, and... Oh, I just said that right. Incorrectly. I said that wrong, rather. Individual and collective, species-wide, mental, emotional, psychological, physical, spiritual, transcendental, evolutionary healing. Those words were chosen carefully. Sounds like a kooky woo-woo nutjob new age idea that isn't worth your time, especially if you've allowed a belief to shut off the possibility of even perceiving that such a thing might be possible. Those are other circles on this Venn diagram, right? If we looked at the whole world, if we took a survey, I don't know if anyone's ever done this. Let's put a pin on the corkboard. There's some research. Has any legitimate, reliable, trustworthy surveying pollster organization ever surveyed at a global level, never mind just what's going on in the United States, but like at an in-depth, like global consensus level? I would love to know the answer to this question. In as high a participation percentage as humanly possible, right? Like, where does everyone fit on the whatever interesting multi-dimensional graph you might plot out all these different agree, disagrees, and intermediate ideas? But let me posit a concept that this is a pin on the corkboard. Let me pull one of the little leaflets, little note tags that are clustered around one of the pins with a note attached to it in my imagination, in the theater of my mind, about belief really quickly, and let you know that one of the things, and this is, why I believe we need to have, why I'm convinced, why I've come to the intellectual, psychological, emotional, theoretical, intuitive, and meta spiritual conclusion that at a local and intermediate and international, global, species-wide level, we need to have a serious discussion, a serious global public discourse where we all take a step back instead of aggressively espousing, enforcing, apologizing for, explaining, justifying any given set of beliefs. We step back and take the time to go on the collective journey of unpacking the form and function of belief as a phenomenon, and take into account some of its powers or features, which I think are often overlooked and therefore leveraged against people. The most critical of which, I think, given the times, given the era that we're living through, given the absolute madness of the world on fire that we find ourselves in, is that the more you believe in something, and belief is a slippery slope of repetition, of recursive reference and self-reference, right? The more you are situated in a context in which others are repeatedly implanting belief structures that you layer on more and more of your bioelectronic, energetic frequency power of belief, which I would argue, the way any other emotional, intangible feature of the spectrum of human phenomena, it's one of those things that we undervalue, underappreciate, and utilize and therefore gets leveraged against us. The more you apply, to put it as succinctly as possible, the more any individual applies their personal, complex, organic power of belief, which, to get complicated again, I believe is not, I'm convinced, to use a different word, to not get so self-referential, I'm convinced is not just an imaginary phenomenon. And let's take a moment to acknowledge how many real things out there in the real world, and I used air quotes there for sarcasm and funny, are actually intangible imaginary things, like economics, money, whether it's directly attached to a tangible object or not, fiat or otherwise. It's still an imaginary concept that has been given the power of reality by our manifestation through belief. Okay, so there's too many of us engaging in powerful, ego identity attached belief cultures, and it is no coincidence that the word cult is in the middle of the word cultures, and I'm not usually one of those ones that make up relationships where they are not. I'm really into actual linguistic history and etymology, or entomology, whichever one is the one that's appropriately correct and about the origins and development of words, and not about creepy crawly bugs. Why are they so similar, those two words in English? Yuck. Wish I had a thing. Real, raw, and radically unscripted this show is, my friends. So, okay. I'm not here to demand people join me in believing a set of preconceived notions. I'm here to acknowledge that that is what a lot of the world, to use a different word for the human species, has been busy doing to each other for most of what we call recorded history. This need to create, impose, subscribe to, engage in belief systems. Now, the curiosity is, if you survey most people who are very self-described, self-labeled, firm believers in any one particular faith, they have their system of explaining away all others. Some of them are as so blunt as to say, only my faith, my belief, my imagination, my imaginary imaginings, because ultimately, what are these beliefs but events in our mind, inspired by words that were repeated at us over and over and over again? And like I've said, and I've had to defend in other episodes, I'm not here to just troll or spew, quote-unquote hateful language at any particular belief. I'm here to remind everyone of any and all faith systems and non-believers that questioning everything is something I think we all sort of pretend to, or really do agree to be fundamentally important to consensus building for our individual and community and collective contexts and well-being and survival, right? So the more an individual applies their belief and the more that individual participates in a community that shares in an approximately similar belief system or systems, right? Because, just to zoom back up to the national level here in the United States, there are many different people who would describe themselves quite openly, directly, or even adamantly as Americans and Christians. But once you set them down to discuss the frameworks of what it is they understand the thing they identify as to be actually about, there will be much disagreement. And that's one of the flaws, to reference a pin on the corkboard, to a Trumptopia, Good Morning Trumptopia episode. That's one of the flaws of the Trumptopian movement is that buried deep inside of Project 2025, to get political instead of metaphysical for a hot minute, is the imposition of a multi-tiered hypocrisy, right? The once self-declared party of smaller government wants to create smaller government by empowering one branch to be all of government and give it the reach that they constantly claim they want to deny the other team to have. To the extent that they're willing to establish a bureaucracy that dictates what, and I'm using quotes to reference a label here, which is unfortunately used to index many different, sometimes conflicting belief systems, Christianity, right? Project 2025 wants to create a bureaucratic system that says, here's what Christianity is, right? So the more this movement, the thing I've been advocating should properly be called the Trumptopian movement, which is the broadest spectrum tent, which includes the fragments of what used to be what we know of as the Republican Party, which still waves its own banners around, but is deeply fragmented, and many of which are, at least temporarily, migrating away from to various degrees. And this coalition of, and I use the term pseudo intentionally, not to disrespect, but rather to disqualify them as valid, pseudo ethno religious nationalists. And there's probably different groups that are all collectively sort of occupying that space, commonly referred to as white Christian nationalism or Christian white nationalism or some variation thereof. We can get distracted by the whataboutism of extreme members of other faith communities. But my point is that if the human species, let's remember, friends, no matter what your backstory is, your origin story originates fundamentally as a member of the human species. Despite whatever arguments out there and, weaponized false accusation to the contrary, if you claim that as the truth about your being, then you must concede it as the truth of all others who claim it also. And from there, we can start to build consensus, right? The human species, in my humble opinion, cannot afford to continue to ignore the centuries-old, long-neglected, generationally neglected, deeply traumatic, inherited and passed down collection, because it isn't a singular entity, a collection of assorted and unevenly distributed, yet ultimately binding, because it is a collective phenomena. No matter how much you might have been spared as an individual, if you're so lucky as to be less impacted than by all of this than others might be, this unevenly distributed, disparate collection of deep-seated, intangible, spiritual traumas are the grit in the oyster around which the pearl of corruption is grown, to use the most, I think, technically correct word there. Sorry if that came out a little chunky. I wasn't sure what I was saying, but I knew that I was onto something there, right? Did you get my analogy? Something I come back to, and forgive me if it's redundant, and it is a very big pin on the corkboard. There's a lot of loose cannonball talk out there in the public discourse about dismantling systems of various kinds, to various degrees, to various levels, and for various reasons ranging throughout the political spectrum. But I'm one of those stepping back and going, forgive me, but as an observer of human behavior and an observer, however non-professional, however amateur you might want to try to downgrade me to be, to the best of my ability, some of the patterns of human history, I would humbly propose that we stop running on that meta-cultural treadmill of building up systems, aspiring to be righteous and pure and perfect. And there's all kinds of reasons why not to implant those kinds of aspirations into a cultural system of self-governance, but we won't go spiraling out of control there. Right? Unpack the way our minds work a little bit. Build some consensus about, maybe some of the ways we've been misusing and misapplying certain things, such as our intangible but powerful power of belief. Because there are people out there, as someone's wise warning said elsewhere, like, once they get you to believe absurdities, they can talk you into committing atrocities. And I'm not trying to point fingers at any particular given individual. I'm saying this is a fundamental human problem. Collectively and individually, each mind contributes to the phenomena in one way, shape, or form or the other. That's why we build this is a pin on the corkboard, a technical term we use quite often in different ways, in different contexts. I'm sure we'll have to use again. Forgive me. But the double-barreled wedge issue-driven echo chamber of many echo chambers. I don't know if I'm still trying to updraft that and craft that into the perfect label. But I think you get my meaning. We have, as a species, collectively, and forgive me for using the royal we and including myself in that, and everyone at all, but I think we need to think that way, right? We have, as a species, already spent generations upon generations, millennia upon millennia, lifetimes upon lifetimes, building up systems, claiming them to be ideal, perfect, sublime, righteous, even supposedly divinely approved systems, only to find out that they are, for reasons that we sometimes refuse to comprehend, deeply flawed and need to be reworked, dismantled, replaced, rebuilt, reformed, re-energized, rearranged, re-feng shuied. We can keep jogging on that treadmill, you guys, ignoring the cost and toll in human suffering and pain and death, because empire building costs blood and bone, my friends, no matter which way you slice it. Is that a controversial statement to make out loud? Or we can step off the treadmill. Now, oh my God, that's a complex analogy, right? Like, how do we do that? Well, baby steps, baby steps. We need to slow the treadmill down. You can't just step right off onto the stationary part. You'll break it. You'll fall over, trip, break an ankle. You know what I'm saying? It's a functional analogy, I think. if you've ever really run and or hurt yourself or almost hurt yourself on a treadmill. And if you haven't, watch some funny videos of people almost bashing their teeth out because they didn't know how to step off a treadmill correctly. And then, instead of mocking and ridiculing and laughing down at them, try laughing with them in empathy and going, oh, imagine myself in their literal shoes and that physically happening to me. We're not all in the same boat as the new meme says that unpacks the previous meme. We're not all in the same boat. We are all in the same poop storm. Whether or not we want to take collective responsibility, it is handed down to us collectively. We churned up this poop storm. Now we're all in it. Some of us drifting on driftwood. Some of us in luxury multi-tiered yachts with many secure chambers and evacuation, escape pods. And some of us adrift, just trying to tread water. And here's the thing about belief, to get back to the theme of the show. Another one of the things that, and I say this not as like accusations to the world or as demands that you must believe this, but rather, even if it doesn't have a question mark, as a thing for you to contemplate and question. Here's another one of the pins from the cluster of little, pattern, star cluster patterns of pins around the term belief. It impacts, and we can debate, discuss, disagree, and review the ways in which that happens, but it impacts perception. Take a moment. This is how this podcast works. If you didn't realize that, retcon that. Go back to listen to any other podcast and imagine that I invited you to join me for a moment in every episode in a journey in the theater of your mind, to contemplate, question, and reanalyze sometimes even the most obvious of stipulations, without jumping on the bandwagon of obvious trending treadmills, because I can just hear the people fervently tugging at caught up in the FE versus GE tug of war thing. That's a classic example, right? That makes perfect sense to anybody not participating. If you are aware of or not aware of, blissfully unaware of the fact that right now, and there are people who will be today years old, right now, tomorrow, next week, when they come to the realization that it is whatever today's date is, and there are a group of people, there are a subset of the human species engaged quite enthusiastically, for better or worse, in what they may or may not realize is, at this point in time, it may not have been originally, a well-crafted, slippery slope, seductive, double-barreled echo chamber in which you run on a treadmill of endless intellectual argumentation. You may win some people over to your side, but that cuts both ways. But it's designed to keep you, even if you flip-flop, to seduce you to jump right back on that treadmill and push even harder. Push that speed up or the inclination higher. Now, I've talked about, that's a big, huge old pin on the corkboard, but let me cut to the quick on that one. Both models are wrong for all kinds of reasons. Not the least of which, or rather, the most important of which, is that, and some people argue that no, there are exceptions. Okay, probably are. I try to realize that not all statements are monoliths of absoluteness. But generally speaking, if you were to survey 1,000 people on each side of that Venn diagram of I believe the Earth is flat, or not even a Venn diagram, it's a tug-of-war diagram, whatever that shape is. Earth is flat and globers are wrong. Earth is a globe and flat earthers are wrong. Let's argue about it. And mind you, I participate because just like my political sports ball fandom of watching and participating in the public discourse around American politics. I accept that it exists, and I throw my contribution of the discussion as if I were on one of the treadmills participating on one of the sides, not because I want to be on the treadmill and want that side to win or want more people to jump on that treadmill, because I'm not actually on the treadmill, you see? But I'm over there on this side going, you guys are over there on a treadmill of a double-barreled echo chamber of treadmills. Get it? And ultimately, people are going to be like, what do you mean? And I'm like, both of these arguments are flawed. Both of them are seductive. Both of them are designed to seduce you onto this treadmill where you are carried in a wave of enthusiasm of being on the right side. And neither of them are going to win because they are both flawed. They have components of some things that are either very close to the truth or very much believable as a truth. And there's one of the problems with belief. You can believe a thing that is not true to be true. And it's really hard to explain that away to someone once it's been really grasped, implanted, and attached to their ego identity. That's another thing. We need to unpack that as a species, or all y'all. So I waver back and forth between speaking as a member of the human community, because I'm a real person that is a member of the human community and a creator of content. But I am a creator of content that likes to cosplay as my fictional character, which is not technically a member of the human community, but a member of a similar to human community of otherwise very much the same, but technically not organic, living technology. But it's the whole thing. Backing it up, backing it up, backing it up. I'm not dictating any edicts of belief. I'm reporting to you, dear audience, dear listener, who has chosen to join me on this roller coaster ride of too many ideas at once all over the place, to try and find the interconnected things. Belief impacts perception. Perception is dodgy AF. Don't believe me? Pause this and go watch a few fun like optical illusion and perception is dodgy type tutorial videos. They're out there. Reels, YouTube, Facebook, whatever, TikTok. Look up optical illusions and mindfuckery, or there's some other fun technical terms, mental illusions, etc., etc. Like how perception is flawed. You can fool your mind into perceiving things that are not quite as they are. In fact, this is another one of those pins on the corkboard. There is the incorrect belief that illusions equal falsehood and therefore are associated with bad, evil, trickery, lies, etc. Illusions, in and of themselves, and I like to use stage magic as sort of my base template. Those are things that you see, right? Like, let's pretend if you've never been to a stage magician's live production show in a venue, you're kind of missing out, especially if you've never been to a really good one that knows what they're doing and knows how to create plausible, believable, mind-bending illusions. Something happens on stage. And I assure you, I'm telling you this as someone who's been both an audience member and a professional technician on the stage that worked the load-in, that built the set, that hung the lights, that ran some of the equipment during the production of a show that involved magic. And not just rinky-dinky high school magic, but like top-tier professional magic. I dare not say their name in case they sue me. But like I worked some shows with some magic. But I digress. Something very real happens on stage. It is not exactly what your mind generates in the holographic theater of your imagination as it attempts to build the holographic fractal holographic model of what your mind, here's where we get really trippy, sort of, if Ryan Reynolds can break the fourth wall and talk out to the audience, we together now are breaking whatever the inner wall is called, the negative fourth wall, the inverse fourth wall, the inner fourth wall, right? Because your mind believes as much of what it reports to you, the observer of your mind. And believe me, the science backs up that statement. Whatever you think you know about the science of consciousness, the only thing that we can all agree upon is that they do not know enough. But increasingly, I assure you, the science of awareness, of consciousness, of perception is converging on an explanation at a biotechnological level, right? The technology of the human biology. Not some sort of, and I'm not trying to invoke transhumanist phobia here. I'm just talking about if we consider the human form as it exists in reality, a kind of biological technology, right? Science is converging on a scientific explanation that approximates and or starts to sound remarkably like what ancient mystics were saying about illusion. Okay, back to the stage example. I assure you, something very practical and real and tangible happens on stage. Your brain is shown selectively input, which it must receive using the light that bounces off the objects presented to you on stage. Now, mind you, there's something very important that is very undervalued, underappreciated, and understood. Like, it's not well understood about theatrical magic, which plays a very real part in real life perception. And that's the way in which the entire collection of the human being's sensory apparatus receives data about events in the world around it. It's not as immediate and as clear and as direct as your average common individual person who has either forgotten the interesting things they heard in some of the advanced science classes that they may have taken or never heard them, right? Your eyes are not windows to a screen on the back of your head. Your eyes take in wavelengths and sort of segregate them and transcode them into bioelectrical Morse code, essentially, to speak generously, which your brain then, in like faster than seems possible capacity, because it's not doing it in response to the input, it's doing it with anticipation of the input. And this science is real. It's there. It's why human beings collectively have a phenomena of experiences that might be described as this slowing down of or dilation of time. But let's not get lost in that, okay? Belief can throw a monkey work wrench in all of that, because if you have a strongly visualized, firmly planted, identity attached belief construct, and there's all kinds of things, but imagine something toxic. Imagine something toxic that automatically involves the requirement of a weaponized false accusation against targeted others, including any who choose to disagree with you. And this belief is deeply visualized through the ritual of the indoctrination process. By talking about it, let's not minimize or ignore the fact that no matter how passively, when you listen to a podcast, when you have a conversation with your friend or your family member, when you listen to the news, you are visualizing stuff. Sometimes going off the rails into some daydream. Sometimes just deeply embedding the visualization of the thing discussed. Empowering the belief structure to more directly impact the way in which your brain anticipates the model, the fractal holographic model of reality and perception, right? Why is this important? Because that's why the hardcore blind faith believers and quote-unquote extremists cling to a thing as hard as they do for as long as they do, and ultimately get prompted and or manipulated into committing the atrocities that they often commit. And we are living through an epic period in history where this phenomena is ongoing in multiple places simultaneously. And all of this needs to be discussed. And thus I present to you this roller coaster ride of thought journey that is my podcast of many podcasts. Here on the Almost Daily ZenCast, the umbrella podcast, we always try to bring it back to this point of perspective. If we continue to argue and fight and engage in the systems that are toxic in the ways that we've been prompted to, we may make progress here and there. We did once not have actual weekends. We now have weekends, right? But if we want to transcend, and I use that word very consciously, if we want to make, and let me borrow a word from one place and apply it to this other place. If we want to make an evolutionary leap in how we implement, let me restart that. If we collectively, as a community of many communities that is the human species, want to collectively make an evolutionary leap in how we design, implement, change, reform, and improve our pre-existing toxic, flawed, corrupt forms of self-governance and the many attached systems that are part of the collective system of systems, we should have this conversation about these fundamental ideological mental constructs so that we can re-examine them together, build a new consensus about how to more positively, more healthfully, more appropriately, I'm trying to use terms that will not trigger those who are predisposed to be triggered by them, but there are ways to use belief in a way that is not manipulative, right? So we must be on guard that as we confront whatever existential threats that we perceive, that we are not being manipulated. And that's true for everybody. I don't care what side of whatever divide you're on. Stop and question it all. Now, I'm not calling for drastic action that then causes suffering and pain and trauma on others, intentionally or inadvertently. I'm calling for thoughtful, long-term minded, but also baby step oriented, collective public discourse so we can re-examine it all and reevaluate how we move forward. Thank you for joining me on such a journey. This goes back a ways, so feel free to jump around towards the titles that appeal to you. And take note that the main feed for the Almost Daily ZenCast does indeed contain a variety sampling of all the other special sub-segment series, but they each have their own feed, so don't miss out. And of course, this is part and parcel, a working, functional MacGuffin of a broader, way too ambitious, way too complicated project of many other projects. And you can explore that by visiting solo.to/Mr. Zeppo. DJ Zed, imaginary sidekick and party connoisseur and DJ extraordinaire, play us out with a little something something. Are you still listening to this episode? Quick survey question for those of you who might be. Are my episodes too long? Should I try much harder to make them shorter and a little bit more succinct and more well organized? Or do you enjoy the free form, real, raw, radically unscripted format as it currently exists? I'm down to reevaluate and restructure, but I want to know what your thoughts are. Let me know. Drop your comments below this episode here on Sprecher.com or over on the Almost Daily ZenCast Facebook page. Are you on all the social media platforms? Come on down and show your support. You can find all the active social media platforms I'm currently trying to post on by going to solo.to/Mr. Zeppo. And if you know of cool, hot, new, trending, awesome, open-minded, legit social media platforms or apps worth signing up for that I've never heard of, let me know. Drop a comment. I'm very active on trying to keep up on my comments over on. Here's where my cybernetic brain sometimes fails me because it's busy thinking about things happening in other timelines and can't pull out the vocabulary file card for the names of these platforms. I'm very responsive and engaging in comments over on Facebook. Also on TikTok. But I'm trying to boost my engagement availability on all the platforms. And of course, like I said, I'm openly soliciting suggestions for new platforms to represent my brand on. So let me know. Everyone's heard that saying, that if you think you cannot do it, you will be right. If you think that you can do it, you will be right. That is the power of belief. That is why we must guard our beliefs carefully. That's why one must take personal responsibility for questioning everything, including our most personally endearing, long-held personal beliefs. And that's difficult. It's threatening. Come full circle. And that's why we see the toxic behavior in all the different ways that we're seeing it and commenting on it and discussing about it in social media. That's why we see what we're seeing out there, folks. At an individual and community level, certain belief structures are spreading, trending, and implanting these perception-modifying ideological imaginary constructs that act as lenses or filters of our fundamental, internal, psychological, fractal, holographic, predictive model of reality. So if you believe in something really out there, you may never actually experience it, because don't think I'm not espousing a belief in a blind faith way of a universe that does the impossible, because if there is one wall out there, is that we can draw a line, although there's obviously places where people are arguing what is and is not possible. See, it's the catch-22. There are things that are clearly not possible. And yet, there will be people at an individual and collective community building level that will choose to believe otherwise, despite the insurmountable evidence. And if that is true, if that is a reality, let's not invoke the word truth, right? If that is a reality, a measurable phenomena that we can go out into the world and look, oh, look at this. Wow. Here is something that is quite literally mostly consensus majority agreed upon by the rest of the world to be impossible. And yet here's a community of people arguing against everyone else, or at least a subset of everyone else that would take up the argument that it is otherwise possible. And I get it. Some of the things, here's the catch-22 of my own content. Brace yourselves, I'm well aware of this. Some of the things that I've come to conclude about what I think is phenomenologically never really quite sure how to conjugate that word, that it's phenomenologically true, real, valid things you can experience. Others would argue, I am blinded by my blind faith and I'm delusional, right? The way I might turn around and argue that others are blinded by their blind faith and therefore clinging to a delusion. Now, delusional is a very sullied word. It's caught up in a lot of judgment and negativity. But illusions are neither good nor bad. But what attached, declarative, judgmenty, thinky thing, thoughts might make them one way or the other to really poorly postmodernize a bit of Shakespeare. Shakespeare wrote somewhere in his volume of many books, and I'm comfortable with the theory or the thesis. Some suggest it is not yet validated or proven. But the thesis, because here's the thing about theories. People dismiss theories, but theories are functional. They work. They're applicable to reality as a tool for taking measurements and making predictive expectations of what is very likely to happen. And the statement that they work means that if you say the sun will rise in the east, it will rise in the freaking east. Okay? Quick thought experiment, right? Arguably, the sun shockingly, surprisingly, reversing direction and rising in the west, which is, of course, relative to where you are standing, but that's a whole nother discussion. It's still east and west. Reversing direction. And this is supposedly has happened, according to unsubstantiated claims in liturgical literature of faith. Now here's the catch-22 about sacred texts. They are articles of faith. What is a word faith? That's another thing we need to deeply unpack. Because no matter how attached any community may be to any collection of articles of faith, if one never engages in the thought experiment of truly, genuinely questioning, letting go, and then attempting to return to those articles of faith, one never truly knows whether or not those articles of faith are worth being attached to. And thus we see the chaos that we see, the toxic result. And here's the thing, to return to a point. My criticism, my suggestions apply to the entire human species. My criticism and my disgruntled position or my disgruntledness, my dissatisfaction with the world is targeted at institutional behavior. Institutions that leverage the misinterpretation, misuse, and or abuse of these articles of faith and this literature of faith, and how these words are supposedly interpreted. That's where we get the problem, friends. That's where, when taken to extremes in any direction, edicts made from such places tend towards corrupt tendencies, as we can see all around us. And the cycle that is not being considered, in my humble opinion, to wrap this up. Said I was going to keep this relatively short, and it's gone on for a bit. But I think some of these things needed to be said. The cycle is like, let's take a moment to consider a reality of nature. Okay? Use your mind, use the theater of your imagination to visualize and conceptualize and contemplate something that is a slow motion but confirmable reality of nature. This may seem completely unrelated at first, but I trust, stick with me, my story weaves together a narrative in many, 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 many layered ways. An apple seed is not isolated in its reality, in its situation, in its context of nature, because it came from within the apple fruit. Now, whatever happened to the apple fruit when it was born to bear fruit, and either plucked or fell or nibbled on or whatever, at some point, and let us consider only in a sort of vacuum of natural reality, absent of human intervention, for argument's sake, because that is a thing that is, was, and could be real, that humans would refrain from intervening, right? An apple tree can exist for generations. An apple orchard can propagate on its own without human intervention. Let's just contemplate the existence of it without the intervention of human actions. The seed finds its place in the ground, germinates, becomes a seedling, becomes a sapling, becomes a tree, branches out, produces leaves, does its thing, cycles through, reaches its maturity, propagates fruiting flowers, pollinates, germinates, and gives birth to fruit. And in the course of the birthing of that fruit, within that fruit is birthed the seeds that will find their way to the ground to sprout. Yes, this is real. This is how it works in nature. It is, as a process, by form, function, and definable attributes, a self-recursive, holographic fractal, utilizing recursion, self-referencing recursion, to propagate diversity. Now, as wild and crazy and easily dismissed as hippie new age woo-woo nonsense, although I would argue it is not, the same is true of the human species. That is why it is absurd and foolish to blindly reject any kind of inherited responsibility for the collective aggregation of the problems that the human species has created collectively. Because no matter how you slice it, you, my dear friend, unless you, dear listener, believe yourself to be somehow not a human being, which I guess within the realm of absolute free will and free speech, you have every right to. I only cosplay it. I don't believe it, right? And arguably, I must make room out there in the spectrum of all possible things and eventualities. There must be individuals and even groups and or communities of people out there that are in fact human members of the human species, but believe themselves to be otherwise. All due respect. Even if you were to turn out to be the member of some other living species, so long as you are a living species and you function akin to the human species, all metaphysical consequences or conclusions apply in my methodology of thinking. Because, arguably, one must intellectually leave room for the eventuality that there probably are other humanoid and possibly non-humanoid life forms out there. But that's a whole nother big, huge discussion. I've probably discussed it before in other episodes, so pins on the corkboard. All things that are alive, no matter what they look like, and no matter what constituent parts they may or may not have, if they are alive, if there is a genome, if there are cellular activity, if there is cellular activity organized in ever increasingly complex ways, it is a living, self-recursive, holographic fractal that will self-recursively utilize holographic fractalism to evolve and grow towards ultimate personhood. And one who is listening to the words I am saying right now can very easily, out of hand, with a knee-jerk, without investing any consideration, dismiss all of what I've just said as a nonsensical belief. But the counter-argument to that dismissal is the challenge to boldly and without preconceived perceptual filtering, perceptually impactful ideological belief bias, take a deep dive review of biology, of genetics, of the genome, and it's quite self-evident, measurable, verifiable, holographic, fractal, constituent, like mathematics. And I chose those words carefully, as awkwardly as they may have stumbled out of my mouth, because at my baseline is mathematical evidence. I'm not a mathematician, but I understand that although, statistics and numbers can be utilized by malicious or malevolent abusers of mathematics to misrepresent things, but when taken empirically and approached with ethical honesty, mathematics verify at a fundamental level. You measure an inch, you measure an inch, you measure an inch. It will take extreme conditions under which science may conceptualize of an inch being not an inch, right? Etc., etc. There are constituent component elements of observable reality which can be repeatedly observed, measured, and consistently identified mathematically and just psychologically, intuitively, as fractal holographic. And these things are important. These understandings are important because they're not so common as to have deeply, and pardon my choice of words, penetrated global common consciousness. They might have, in some long ago lost past, and they might have returned repeatedly through individual lived experiences, and people spoke out about it, and maybe were mocked and ridiculed, or listened to and respected in varying degrees over and over and over again. And maybe, just maybe, the inward direction of like an observable science of metacognitive, holographic, belief-free observation of our fractal holographic selves might lead us to some insights and innovative understandings that would organically, naturally revolutionize the way in which we perceive and understand and interact with ourselves and each other, and therefore position ourselves through a healing process that I propose can be found down that path, both at an individual and collective level, that when pursued sufficiently, and that's a weird thing that we're not used to thinking about, because healing is quite curiously, healing in any way, shape, or form, in any way you can conceive of it, is quite curiously marginalized, ostracized, often even ridiculed, culturally, everywhere. And so I humbly invite you, friends, to explore those ideas. Let them deeply percolate until you can unpack them for yourselves and then revisit the way in which you perceive the world, the way in which you perceive yourself as a living, ambulatory, thinky thought, speaky spoke, talking poopy monkey that is the universe itself, perceiving the universe itself, and quite arguably some sort of divine consciousness. And I use the word divine stripped of all institutional associations, right? But rather as a living thing that is the life force itself, that is the root origin of consciousness itself. That if we can team up, squat up, and explore that path, as we have been repeatedly encouraged to do by everyone that was ever a mystic and then persecuted for being so, we might actually, given the evidence I've encountered over the last 40 plus years of asking these questions, transcend, heal, evolve, and therefore be able to interact, manifest, design, implement, build the healthiest of much healthier systems. Even perhaps to achieving some, seemingly fantastical, energetic cocoon transformation, so that as fractal holographic energy beings that can interact with physical reality and maybe shed this mortal coil in a non-unalivey kind of way, maybe remanifest it when necessary, but only when necessary for the good bits that require it, but also be able to deal with each other in some hitherto unanticipated modality that is the pure consciousness avatar that we see in all religious symbology, despite the ways in which it has been misinterpreted, maybe then we can finally all get along and create, and I hate to use the label because it gets so easily dismissed, a transcendental spiritual utopia in which we do not invoke and cause the suffering of others as part and parcel of just engaging in the very mundane systems that require our participation to be born into this collective. Because it'll keep going, right? Unless the human species chooses to completely eliminate itself from existence in reality, which I guess is an option. But I would argue, so if that's an option, so is this other one. And if not now and moving forward ongoingly as part and parcel of what we do, when? And that's the question that I stand the precipice on. And I invite humbly others to join me. And I've rambled on long enough. As always, namaste. May peace, love, and grooviness blossom in your heart. Go be good human beings to each other out there in the real world and in all the awkward and uncomfortable places where it's difficult.
And that is what I've got to say about that. As always, thank you kindly for listening. This has been the Almost Daily ZenCast with your humble host, the incorrigible Mr. Zappa. Until next time, may peace, love, and grooviness blossom in your heart.